Welcome to The Clue Cafe, where mysteries brew and every detail matters. I'm thrilled to have you here. Whether you're a lifelong detective fiction fan or just love a good puzzle, you've found the right place. Before we dive into today's mystery, let me know in the comments, where in the world are you tuning in from? I'd love to see how far our curious community reaches. Chapter 1. A Skeleton in the Cellar. It was on an unseasonably warm morning in mid-May that a local workman, employed to clear out the decaying ruins of Lady Rathbone's long-vacated hovel in Holloway, stumbled upon a discovery fit for a sensational inquest. The building, its timbers sagging and bricks crumbling, bore all the marks of long neglect, lattices of ivy clinging to shattered window panes, and the air heavy with damp and decay. Yet it was in the dank, low-ceilinged cellar, barely illuminated by a high-set barred window, that the earth gave up its hidden secret. Human bones, arranged in grotesque repose around a rusted dagger still buried in the grit and mortar. The workman's instinct, perhaps tempered by tales of ghosts and old scandals, prompted him to summon the local constable, a stout man of conscientious demeanour with more experience in wayward livestock than in mortal remains. By the time Dr. Watson arrived, called by Her Majesty's government to assist on matters medical, the scene was already buzzing with whispered conjecture. The bones lay half exposed, the dagger's blade driven through what had once been the man's collarbone, its hilt encrusted with greenish rust. The constable, notebook in hand, eyed Watson with a measure of relief. Here was a professional who might divine the manner and perhaps the date of death. Holmes followed at a more leisurely pace, his tall frame clothed in a well-cut Norfolk jacket, his hawk-like gaze visibly alive at the scent of fresh puzzle. He passed under the lintel without a word, stooped to inspect the remains, and prodded the dagger's haft with the tip of his walking stick. Watson, accustomed to such scenes yet still moved by the sobering sight of mortal fragility, knelt beside him to note the bone structure and signs of post-mortem disturbance. "Observe, Watson," Holmes murmured, "the precise angle at which this weapon was forced home. Note how the blade entered on a descending trajectory, as though swung from above, rather than thrust with intention." He tapped the exposed dagger gently, eliciting a faint metallic clink. "Moreover, the erosion on the hilt is peculiar. This dagger appears to have lain here for many years, yet the blade itself is comparatively intact. Someone went to considerable trouble to conceal it." Watson surveyed the cellar walls, a rough brick embrace stained by moisture, with scorch marks fanning out around a small recess at the far end. "A fire," he suggested, "perhaps to destroy evidence." Holmes nodded. "Quite so, but why, Watson, does the scorch surround that alcove and nowhere else? It speaks of a controlled flame, not a conflagration. One might hazard that documents or letters were consumed here. Papers sometimes burn more thoroughly than a body, leaving little but ash. And yet the dagger remains, a calamitous oversight, or perhaps placed with grim deliberation." The constable cleared his throat. "Sir, the local registries show no record of a disappearance hereabouts 10 years ago. No missing person reports, no inquiries, nothing. And the letters we found in the top drawer of Lady Rathbone's bureau bear the date 1915, though most of them are illegible." "Indeed," said Holmes, stepping back to appraise the cellar's layout. The hovel was once part of the Rathbone estate's wine store. See here, the low arch and bricked-over niches originally used to cradle casks. At some point, the walls were hacked away to enlarge the room, or perhaps to fashion a confessional of sorts. A confession here, Watson, though to what end? He swept his gaze over the damp floor, then bent to pick up an ochre-stained scrap of paper, half decayed. The constable handed him a small envelope stamped with the Rathbone crest. Inside he found a fragment of a letter addressed to one Maurice Ellison, signed in a bold copperplate. "Ellison?" Holmes repeated thoughtfully. The name corresponds with a clerk employed by Lady Rathbone's estate during the Great War. His duties would have granted him access to private papers. It seems he vanished without trace around the summer of 1915, but no official inquiry followed. War, scandal, and the lady's dread of public exposure doubtless saw to that. Watson frowned. "So this skeleton is Maurice Ellison's remains, and he lay here hidden for the best part of 10 years? Holmes pocketed the letters with methodical precision. "That is the most plausible conclusion. Yet why was his fate unrecorded? Why no neighbour raised alarm? And why, after a decade of anonymity, has his secret been laid bare only now?" He stood, shoulders squared in thought. The cellar's present state almost suggests an attempt at deliberate concealment. Scorched documents, mutilated brickwork. Someone wished Ellison's knowledge and perhaps his person removed from the world. On the staircase above, a timid figure descended. The hovel's former caretaker, Mrs. Aldridge, now 82 and bent with time, trembling as she approached the circle of men. "Begging pardon, sir," she quavered. "I was but a child back then, but I recall there was talk of a quarrel on the very night Maurice vanished. Lady Rathbone stormed about, ravings of betrayal and dishonour. I heard the door slam and the clatter of plates thrown against the wall. Next morning, Maurice was gone, and the cellar was sealed." Holmes' eyes brightened. "You say plates, Mrs. Aldridge, and that she sealed the cellar?" "Aye, sir. The door was barred the next day and the key taken away. Nobody thought twice, for Lady Rathbone never spoke of it." Watson put a consoling hand on the old woman's arm. "Thank you, Mrs. Aldridge. That will do for now." As she tottered away, Holmes drew his notepad and jotted 2 words. Quarrel, sealing. Then he tapped the dagger's hilt again. The physical evidence, the scorch marks, the sealing of the cellar, they all point to a desperate act. But whose desperation? And what secret lay within those charred papers? He turned to Watson. "We must secure the Rathbone family archives and interview those who knew Maurice Ellison. There may be living witnesses, if we can locate them, who recall more than Mrs. Aldridge." The constable nodded briskly, already making notes of Holmes's instructions. Watson rose, dusting his cuffs. "Will you be needing me at Scotland Yard, Holmes?" Holmes tucked the letters into an inner pocket and affixed his gaze upon the narrow stairwell. "Indeed, Watson, and I shall pay a visit to Inspector Lestrade at once. Your medical opinion will serve an invaluable purpose in clarifying the time and cause of death. Meanwhile, I shall inspect this dagger more closely under the gas lamp at Baker Street. There are markings here that may betray its origin, and a family crest neatly scratched upon the pommel, worn nearly away by time. A crest merged from 2 households, Rathbone and Ellison, I suspect." As they emerged from the cellar's gloom into the brightening morning, Holmes paused to look back. The ivy-shrouded ruins of Lady Rathbone's hovel stood mute and indifferent to the centuries passing, yet within its walls lay a story of love, betrayal, and long-buried violence. Holmes turned to Watson with his trademark calm detachment. "Come, Watson, let us see what 10 years of secrecy and neglect will reveal under the scrutiny of reason and observation. Maurice Ellison may have slept in the earth this decade past, but I have no doubt that by nightfall his tale will be told." And with that promise they set off toward Baker Street, the first steps in unravelling the case of the Decennial Dagger. Chapter 2. Lestrade's Lament. The following morning found Holmes and Watson ensconced within the familiar bustle of Scotland Yard, where Inspector Lestrade awaited them in a draughty office stacked high with case files. A single oil lamp flickered on the desk, illuminating Lestrade's stern countenance. He rose, offering a curt nod as Holmes entered. Watson observed the inspector's thin lips tighten in apparent frustration. A man vexed by an unsolved crime, no matter its age. "Good morning, gentlemen," Lestrade began. "I trust your examination of Lady Rathbone's cellar yielded useful results?" He sank into his chair, motioning for them to sit. Holmes placed the rusted dagger, now wrapped in brown paper, carefully upon the table and produced the fragmentary letters addressed to Morris Ellison. "I have identified the remains as those of Mr. Ellison, a clerk who vanished in 1915, Lestrade said, running a finger down a ledger. "The family claimed he eloped, and with the war on, no one pressed the matter, hence no missing persons report." Holmes steepled his fingers. "The lack of official inquiry has allowed a full decade of silence," he said. "Yet knowing that Ellison was engaged to Lady Rathbone's niece, Mrs. Vivienne Lytton, we have a starting point. Do you possess any estate records that might shed light on his employment and personal dealings?" Lestrade tapped the ledger. "Here are his pay ledgers and correspondence logs. He was of impeccable character, so the records show, yet his wages abruptly ceased in July of 1915. His final entry in the hall book records a meeting with Lady Rathbone, though the notes omit any mention of Vivienne." Watson frowned. "A meeting without reference to his fiancée seems odd. The spark that lights love should have merited a notation." Lestrade shrugged. "Lady Rathbone was a formidable presence. She may have wished to keep the engagement discreet, but more intriguingly, the fire-blackened cellar suggests someone destroyed particular documents." He leaned forward. "We have uncovered scorch marks consistent with a small ritual burning. The caretaker, Mrs. Aldridge, recalls that the cellar door was barred the morning after Ellison vanished. Why conduct a private ceremony in wine storage?" Holmes's eyebrow arched. "En ritual or expedient concealment?" he mused aloud. Papers burned swiftly, leaving little residue. "If the dagger was intended as a red herring, the true prize was whatever Ellison discovered here." He paused to examine the ledger's margin notations. "See here, cryptic entries labelled T. Do you know what that refers to?" Lestrade shook his head. "It appears only twice, both adjacent to entries for private consultations. The shorthand tumbles elsewhere in the clerk's handwriting. Perhaps he used it as a cipher." Holmes made a quick note. "We must decode the cipher and ascertain what it signifies. Meanwhile, I shall question Mrs. Lytton. Did she ever speak to her uncle regarding Morris's disappearance?" Watson interjected. "I accompanied Holmes to the Rathbone townhouse. Mrs. Lytton professed ignorance of her uncle's quarrel with Ellison, yet she exhibited visible distress when the cellar and its contents were mentioned. And," Lestrade added, "her maid claims to have overheard a heated dispute one evening in midsummer 1915, though no names were attached. The maid alleged hearing plates thrown against the wall and a door slammed with such force it shook the house, yet no action was taken at the time." Holmes rose, tucking the ledger under his arm. "We have 3 lines of inquiry: the cipher XIII, the damaged documents, and the identity of any third party present at Ellison's final meeting. Lestrade, secure the ledger and preserve its chain of custody. I shall examine the ledger's paper and ink for signs of alteration. Perhaps the clerk's final entries were deliberately obscured." Lestrade inclined his head. "Very good, Holmes. I will have the clerk's original book sealed and sent to your lodgings with all haste." Holmes paused by the door, turning to Watson. "Our next step is to visit Mrs. Lytton and, if possible, obtain access to the Rathbone family chapel. The scorch marks in the cellar suggest a connection to ritualistic elements, and I suspect the chapel may harbour evidence. Watson, will you accompany me, or do you wish to analyse the remains further?" Watson smiled at his friend's calm confidence. "I shall prepare my notes on the skeletal remains and arrange for a post-mortem to determine precise time of death. I will join you at the chapel in the afternoon." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Excellent. Lestrade, thank you for your cooperation. I trust that, armed with fresh evidence, we may soon unravel the decade-old mystery." As Holmes and Watson departed the yard, Lestrade returned to his files, muttering about the unusual zeal of the detective. Outside, London's grey skies rumbled faintly, an echo of the storm of secrets now stirred after 10 years of slumber. Holmes strode on, pipe alight, contemplative. The game had scarcely begun. Chapter 3. The Widow's Web. The Rathbone townhouse on Connaught Square bore every mark of genteel respectability: polished mahogany doors, crimson Turkish carpets, and gilt-edged mirrors that caught both light and gossip in equal measure. Holmes and Watson arrived shortly after noon, admitted by a footman whose stiff upper lip almost betrayed his anxiety. Inside the entrance hall, portrait after portrait of sober-faced Rathbones watched as the detectives ascended a broad staircase lined by a scarlet runner. Watson noted the hush that enveloped them, as though the walls themselves bore witness to long-buried secrets. They were received in the drawing-room by Mrs. Vivian Lytton née Ellison, now a widow of 6 years and niece to the late Lady Rathbone. Tall and composed, her dark hair swept up into an elegant chignon, Mrs. Lytton inclined her head with polite reserve. Watson perceived immediately that her manner, though gracious, was underlaid with a tremor of anxiety. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she greeted, her voice calm yet barely masking an undercurrent of tension. "I trust you require nothing distressing." Holmes watched her keenly. "Thank you, Mrs. Lytton. We are here to discuss the unfortunate discovery of your late husband's remains. You understand the necessity of our inquiries?" She bowed. "Of course, but I fear I have little to offer. Maurice vanished some 10 years ago, as I'm sure you know. My uncle, Lady Rathbone, claimed he had eloped, and I thought the matter closed." Holmes inclined his head. "Indeed, yet new evidence suggests that your husband's disappearance was neither voluntary nor discreet. We hope you might recall any circumstances surrounding his final days, particularly any disagreements with Lady Rathbone." Vivian's lips tightened. "Uncle was—" She paused, frowning as though struggling against a deeper reluctance. "My husband and I hoped to marry with my aunt's blessing, but she objected vehemently. She believed Maurice unsuited to the Rathbone name. There were arguments, but I never witnessed violence." Watson leaned forward. "Mrs. Lytton, your aunt and your husband disagreed in your presence?" "Yes," Vivian admitted, fingers twisting the lace handkerchief in her lap. "On a handful of occasions. Once, after a dinner party, I overheard raised voices. My uncle and Maurice spoke sharply. I intervened. Maurice begged me to leave them to confer, but I returned later to find Maurice gone and the house in uneasy quiet." She clenched the handkerchief. "He assured me all was well. I never imagined otherwise." Holmes regarded her thoughtfully. "And that was the last time you saw him?" She nodded, gaze dropping. "Yes, on the evening of 3rd July 1915. After midnight, he kissed me goodnight and returned to the drawing-room. I fell asleep in our chambers. When I woke, he was gone." "Did you search the house that night?" Holmes asked. "My aunt's servants assured me she had retired early. The staff said they heard nothing after I left the drawing-room." Vivian's shoulders trembled slightly. It was as though he had vanished into thin air. Holmes noted the shallow gouge on the corner of the mahogany desk beside her, an impressively carved bureau that had clearly once served as Maurice's workspace. The scratch, he observed, was fresh enough to suggest it had been prized recently. He bent to examine it and ran a gloved finger along the gouge. "Curious," he murmured. "This mark appears to have been made by a letter opener or similar implement. Has this desk remained untouched since—" She flushed. "This? Oh, after the discovery in the cellar, I had this desk moved from the room. It seemed a poor reminder of past horrors." Holmes straightened, eyes narrowing in satisfaction. "A sensible precaution, perhaps, but I should like to examine the remaining contents of that room. May we see the desk's former location?" Vivian hesitated, then rose. "Very well, follow me." She led them through a dim corridor to a panelled study on the first floor. The hearth bore scattered papers, estate ledgers, correspondence, and a few half-burnt envelopes. Holmes moved among them, gently lifting each in turn. "Here," he said, pointing to a partially consumed letter bearing the Rathbone crest. "This envelope was opened with considerable care, its flap torn so as not to shred the seal. One might suppose the sender wished discretion. Yet the letter was never delivered. Do you recognize the handwriting?" Vivian leaned over and peered at the faint script. "It resembles Morris's hand, but I cannot be certain. He had many admirers who wrote to him in confidence, as you say." Watson chimed in. "The scorch marks are recent, unusual for a room so seldom disturbed." Holmes pocketed the charred letters and turned to Vivian. "Mrs. Lytton, you mentioned heated discussions with your aunt and your husband. Did you ever encounter a third party joining these debates?" Vivian's face paled. I recall only one stranger. A gentleman, I think, in dark tweed with an acquisition order for estate documents. He claimed urgency in sorting some business on my aunt's behalf. Maurice was there when he arrived." "A solicitor, perhaps?" Holmes asked. "Possibly. He spoke with my aunt in the study, then turned to Morris, who seemed startled. I remember Morris's pale face. He hurried the stranger away from the great table, toward the cellar door, but Lady Rathbone insisted they speak in private." Vivian shivered. "They went down to the cellar. I tore upstairs to fetch papers Morris requested, but they had barred the door behind them." Watson exchanged a glance with Holmes. "And the cellar remained sealed until today?" She nodded. "Yes. I assumed Morris had been sent away. I did not think to dismantle the lock." Her eyes glistened. "If I had known? If only I had—" Holmes placed his hand on her wrist, gently. "You acted without malice, Mrs. Lytton, but your recollection of the mystery solicitor may prove crucial. Had he a name?" Vivian swallowed. "I believe my aunt referred to him as Mr. Beaumont." Holmes's lips pressed into a thin line. "Beaumont, a common name, but one worth investigating. Your aunt would hardly entrust her private affairs to a stranger without cause." He cast his gaze about the room, noting details that escaped Watson's notice. The angle of the ink stains on a blotter, the slight dip in the floorboards beside the desk where a small safe might once have stood. "And yet," Holmes continued, "I find it curious that your aunt never spoke of this solicitor again. Has Mr. Beaumont ever visited since that night?" Vivian shook her head. "Never. I asked after him, but my aunt would not brook further questions. She instructed the staff never to admit him again." Holmes tapped his pipe against his palm. "A man barred, a cellar sealed, and a body buried, all in the service of a secret. The identity and motives of Mr. Beaumont warrant scrutiny. Watson, we must secure the visitor book at Beaumont's chambers and interview the solicitors who dealt with the Rathbone estate. It seems our mystery solicitor may have served purposes darker than mere business." Watson folded his arms. "Do you believe he's slain Maurice Ellison to prevent disclosure?" Holmes's gaze drifted momentarily to the window where sunlight sifted through lace curtains. not slain, perhaps, but rendered silent, whether by accident or intention remains to be seen. It may be that Ellison confronted the solicitor over something found in the cellar, those charred papers, for instance, and paid for his curiosity with his life. Or it may be that Lady Rathbone herself ordered the deed, and Beaumont served as the instrument. Vivian exhaled a trembling breath. I should never have allowed that man into our home. Holmes inclined his head. Madam, hindsight is a cruel judge. You did what many would under the circumstances. But now, truth requires us to trace Mr. Beaumont's movements that night. His visit, his instructions to seal the cellar, all must be verified. He turned to Watson. Let us retire for a moment to my rooms, Watson. I shall examine the scorch patterns, the ledger entries, and these charred letters in full light. You, meanwhile, may care to write to Messrs. Pollard and Buxton, solicitors, I believe they share offices with Mr. Beaumont's firm, and request any attendance records. Watson offered his arm to Vivienne. I will attend to those matters at once. In the meantime, Mr. Holmes and I shall reconvene at Baker Street by 5 o'clock. As they withdrew, Holmes paused at the door, observing the study's silent testimony. The half-burnt correspondence, the faint odour of singed vellum, and the subtle shift in the floor where inquisitive footsteps had trod. He glanced back at Mrs. Lytton, whose slender form trembled with unspoken remorse. Courage, Mrs. Lytton. In time your husband's fate shall be honoured with the justice it deserves. With those words, Holmes and Watson descended the staircase into London's clamorous streets, the afternoon sun glinting on damp pavements. Behind them, the physician's gentle reassurance and the detective's resolute purpose merged into the singular aim that guided every investigation of the mind: to render the invisible visible, to speak for the voiceless, and to bring clarity to the clouded recesses of human action. Thus closed the third chapter of the Decennial Dagger's tale, yet for Holmes it was merely the hinge upon which the case would swing toward its ultimate revelation. Chapter 4. The Rusted Clue. Late that afternoon, under a leaden sky promising rain, Holmes bade Watson accompany him once more to the Holloway hovel where Maurice Ellison's remains had been discovered. The sodden grass around the building's exterior squelched beneath their boots, and the door, long since unhinged, hung askew on its broken frame. Drizzling rain sifted through the shattered panes, casting a dim sheen over the interior, as though the walls themselves wept for the crime they had witnessed. Holmes carried a small case wrapped in oilcloth. Inside lay tools for delicate excavation, trowel, tongs, brushes, and a light hammer. Watson, armed with his medical satchel, offered to assist, but Holmes merely smiled. "We shall not disturb the skeleton further," he said. "I suspect the greater prize lies elsewhere." He led the way through the once-furnished front room and down the narrow stair to the dank cellar. There, among the rubble and the long-decayed coffin boards, Holmes paused before a moss-covered mound at the cellar's far side. "Observe, Watson," he whispered, kneeling. With his trowel, he cleared away a thick mat of damp vegetation and dislodged the earth beneath. A dull glint of metal emerged, a hilt blackened by age and coated in verdigris. "The dagger's twin," Holmes said, lifting the object carefully by its haft. "Our murderer, or concealer, separated these blades at the time of the crime. One blade remained lodged in Ellison's body, the other discarded here." He brushed soil from the pommel, revealing an ornate crest etched into the ironwork. Two intertwined shields, one bearing a stylized raven, the other a rising sun. Watson peered at the hilt. "It matches the dagger we removed down to the filigree," he observed. "But why retain one and discard the other? Why not destroy both?" Holmes studied the crest with narrowed eyes. A symbol, Watson, not mere ornament. The raven and sun, emblems that speak of nocturnal secrets laid bare by daylight. A curious choice. These weapons appear ceremonial rather than martial, perhaps used in some private ritual or as a mark of family tradition. He turned the dagger over, exposing a strip of leather around the crossguard. With his penknife, he sliced a minute fragment. Leather from an officer's field boot by the grain. Not native to any London soul, I suspect German manufacture, perhaps wartime surplus worn by officers returning after the armistice. Watson's eyebrows rose. German officer, you say? Do you think Ellison stumbled upon espionage? Holmes nodded. A plausible theory. Morris, employed as a clerk with access to private papers, may have uncovered correspondence between Lady Rathbone and enemy agents. To protect her reputation and perhaps her fortune, someone with connections to that correspondence silenced him. The German leather fragment suggests the killer either wore such boots or wished to implicate one who did. He replaced the dagger's twin carefully in the earth and stood, water trickling from his coat. Holmes scraped at a crack in the mossy masonry until a narrow slot appeared. Inside, he discovered a half-decayed vellum scroll, its tightly rolled form stuck fast by damp. Employing gentle pressure, he extracted it and unrolled a charred segment. Written in spidery ink was the Roman numeral XIII, beneath which were the beginnings of a word, conf. Then the text dissolved into burn. Holmes closed his eyes, drawing breath. 13 again, he murmured. Not a random notation, a cipher, surely, perhaps signaling the 13th station of some moral code, or a date, the 13th day of a month. Conf could read confession, the clandestine act that took place here. Watson examined the fragment. But why burn this scroll yet preserve the daggers? It is as though the killer wished to erase Ellison's knowledge but leave a mocking sign of his own deed. Holmes tucked the scroll into his coat pocket. A signature, Watson, a message. Our culprit desired that his handiwork be discovered eventually, perhaps to remind the Rathbones of their owed debt, or to taunt occult notions of ritual sacrifice. Notice the scorch marks around the alcove's arch. They do not radiate indiscriminately but follow a circular pattern, as though a brazier was set in the center to consume documents by rotation. This was not hasty concealment, but a deliberate ceremony. Watson shivered at the notion. A ceremony of destruction and concealment. How fitting that it took place in a former wine vault, a place of jovial counsel turned to dark confessions. Holmes smiled wryly. You have a poet's tongue, my friend. Now we must decode this cipher and trace the origin of the twin blades. I intend to visit the armory of Messrs. Hart and Silverton in Cheapside, known for their collection of antiquated weapons. Their catalogue may reveal the crest's provenance. He stood brushing off his knees, and I shall forward the leather fragment to my contacts at the German consulate's bootmakers division. They may confirm the manufacturer and narrow down the wearer's rank and unit. Watson pocketed the vellum fragment Holmes had given him. May I accompany you to Hart and Silverton? I wish to see their collection. It might offer further context. By all means, Holmes replied. But first I propose one more stop at the consulting rooms of Dr. Edmund Sterling. Ellison's final diary entries were reportedly kept with him for safekeeping. If those entries mention the cipher or Mayor Maurice's suspicions, we may uncover the catalyst for this macabre tableau. They ascended the cellar stairs into the damp afternoon, Holmes pausing at the hovel's threshold to cast a last glance at the broken facade. This place has offered us but scant clues, he said, yet each proves more curious than the last. A twin dagger, a burned confession, and now a German fragment, all point to a conspiracy that extends well beyond mere family scandal. Watson slung his satchel over his shoulder. Do you believe Lady Rathbone herself orchestrated this? Not alone, I suspect, Holmes replied. She had motive, protecting her niece's inheritance and her own reputation, but she would not soil her hands with murder. Our culprit wielded knife and flame, calling on symbols older than either. We must ascertain whether he acted in her name or for his own sinister ends. They walked to the nearby omnibus stop, where Holmes outlined their plan. You will accompany me to Dr. Sterling's rooms on Cavendish Square, while I send my clerk to Hart and Silverton. Later I shall join Dr. Sterling, and thence proceed to Cheapside. In the meantime, Watson, do continue with your post-mortem analysis. I wish to compare the dagger's blade angle with the scar on Ellison's clavicle to determine the force and intent of the strike. As the carriage lurched away, Watson reflected on Holmes's words. The puzzle had grown stranger still. What ritual lay behind the twin blades? Who had burned the confession? And why, after a decade, conjure a dagger's signature only to leave tantalizing fragments? A spy, a conspirator, or a priest of an archaic order? Only the next few days promised to reveal which. Deep in thought, Watson settled back as Holmes traced a route in the morning papers, eyes alive with anticipation. For the game, he knew, was far from over, and the case of the Decennial Dagger would yet demand every ounce of his classical discernment and unerring logic. Thus closed the fourth chapter, yet the mystery deepened, propelling Holmes and Watson toward revelations darker than either had foreseen. Chapter 5. The Art Dealer's Alibi. Holmes and I made our way to Mayfair on an overcast afternoon, the air thick with the promise of rain. Holmes carried himself with that purposeful calm which bespoke a mind already abuzz with conjecture. Our destination was the gallery of Mr. Sebastian Pollard, a dealer in fine art whose name had surfaced in our inquiries, not as a suspect in motives of espionage or secret ritual, but rather as a potential witness if nothing else. Pollard had been close to the Rathbone circle, and his recollections of Maurice Ellison's final days might yet yield illumination. The gallery at 12 Bruton Street was a study in cultivated taste. Walls painted the palest of dove greys to emphasize the brushwork of the canvases, gilt frames gleaming softly under diffused skylights. A grand marble bust of Botticelli presided over the entrance, flanked by vases of freshly cut lilies. Pollard himself emerged from a side room, a tall, slender man in his early 40s, impeccably dressed in a charcoal three-piece suit. His dark hair was flecked with silver at the temples, and his fine-featured face bore a trace of a perpetual smile. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, how good of you to call," he greeted, extending a slender hand. His voice was cultured, his manner urbane, to the degree of theatrical polish. "I trust you wish to view my latest acquisitions? I have several Claude Monet landscapes that might interest you." Holmes glanced at me with a faint upward twitch of his lips. "Not today, Mr. Pollard. We are here on personal rather than professional business. It concerns your acquaintance with the late Maurice Ellison and a certain attendance at Lady Rathbone's estate more than 10 years ago. We hope you can recall the precise circumstances." Pollard's smile faded, replaced by a polite concern. Of course. I was only a young dealer then, scarcely established in London society, but I did know Maurice, and indeed Mrs. Lytton. My recollection is that I visited Holloway on a single occasion, in late June of 1915, to inspect some family heirlooms that Lady Rathbone wished to consign. Holmes inclined his head. "And did you not also court Mrs. Lytton at the same time? You once mentioned to us a shared interest in Impressionist works, which, I understand, first brought you into her acquaintance." "I confess," Pollard said with a slight flush, "that I admired Mrs. Lytton's taste in art. But it was a professional engagement. I was negotiating on behalf of several continental clients who valued discreet purchases. As for any personal attachment, that was merely youthful fancy, unrequited and soon forgotten. Holmes produced a small notebook. Your gallery's ledgers show a purchase of 2 Renoir paintings dated August 1918, 3 years after Ellison's disappearance. Yet you tell us your initial meeting with Mrs. Lytton and, incidentally, with Morris Ellison occurred in June 1915. Is that correct? Pollard's gaze flickered. Yes, that is correct. Curious, Holmes said, tapping the notebook. I happened upon an auction catalogue for the Mornington sale, which lists you as a bidder for a series of French sketches dated July 1916. You appear there under the same name and address you used in 1918. Pollard's composure betrayed a minor crack. He cleared his throat. Auction catalogues can be misleading. They list bidders who registered interest, not necessarily those who attended in person. I may have submitted a proxy bid. Holmes fixed him with a steady look. Proxy bids would nevertheless require your signature and identification, the same as if you were present. Furthermore, the Mornington sale took place on the 12th of July 1916, just 1 year after Monsieur Ellison vanished. You claim you did not meet Mrs. Lytton until 1918, yet your own signature appears in these 1916 records. Pollard's lips pressed together. After a beat of silence, he admitted, I confided to a mutual acquaintance that I had been introduced to Mrs. Lytton earlier, but it is true that the bulk of our dealings culminated in 18. The catalogue entry may reflect an earlier registration I made without her knowledge. Holmes raised a slender finger. But you do not claim to have visited Holloway in 1916, do you? That engagement, you stated, was in 1915 alone. And yet you registered in person at Mornington a year later, a curious discrepancy of dates. I find it unlikely that such details escaped your memory entirely. Pollard shrugged, eyes downcast. I was, and remain, passionate about my profession. Dates blur when one has half a dozen auctions and exhibitions to oversee. I assure you, my memory serves my art more than the calendar. I stepped in. Mr. Pollard, we are grateful for your candor, but might you recall any instance, however faint, of encountering Ellison after June 1915? Even a brief greeting at a public auction? He paused as though summoning a distant memory. I believe I did see him once more, at the Regent Street Galleries in September of that year. He was examining etchings by Whistler. We nodded, exchanged pleasantries, but I did not speak at length. After that, military duties called him away, if I remember rightly. Holmes tapped his lips. Military duties? Ellison was a civilian clerk. Are you certain of his enlistment? Pollard shook his head. Perhaps I was mistaken. I thought he was called up. It may have been that he left London for personal reasons. Holmes made a notation. Very well. You have placed Ellison in your recollections until at least September 1915. Yet your gallery records do not place you in Holloway after that June. And I note you made no mention of him in your surviving correspondence until years later when you wrote an obituary tribute. A gentleman of taste and sensitivity would surely mourn publicly at the time if your acquaintance was close. Pollard's cheeks coloured. My writings were private, intended for limited circulation. I did not wish to distress Mrs. Lytton further. Holmes closed his notebook with a composed gesture. Mr. Pollard, I have no evidence to suggest you bore Ellison ill will. On the contrary, your reluctance to speak of those months suggests genuine sorrow. Yet the inconsistencies in your testimony and the catalogue records require further scrutiny. I shall request an inspection of your gallery's visitor book and the Mornington sale archives to confirm your admissions. Pollard inclined his head. I understand. I will make those documents available. I hope my errors do not cause undue hindrance to your inquiry." Holmes's gaze softened fractionally. "Not hindrance, but clarity. Always welcome. You may retire now, Mr. Pollard. Should further questions arise, my clerk will summon you." As we left the gallery, Holmes mused aloud. "Our art dealer neither destroyed Ellison nor concealed his remains, yet he stands before us adorned with that most enigmatic of human motivators, jealousy. He misremembered dates to obscure his courtship of Vivian, perhaps believing it shameful to admit how closely their paths intertwined. But I doubt he dared cross the threshold of murder. I glanced at him, inquisitive. "Then our Pollard is exonerated?" Holmes tapped the brim of his deerstalker. "Not fully exonerated, Watson, but relegated to the realm of red herrings. His inconsistencies open a window into Ellison's social circle, yet the true culprit's identity remains hidden elsewhere. We must now turn our attention to the cipher XIII and that curious mention of the confessor. I propose we revisit the Rathbone chapel and question Father Beaumont on his private engagements, if indeed he was admitted there." A sudden patter of rain began on the cab's roof as we hailed a hansom. The city's lamps flickered alive in the gathering dusk, and Holmes inhaled deeply. "The game continues, Watson," he said, "and I suspect our true adversary will reveal himself only when all but one blade remains unsheathed." Thus closed the 5th chapter of the Decennial Dagger's tale, an artful detour that led to fresh questions and a clearer path toward the story's heart of conspiracy and concealed motives. Chapter 6. A Decayed Diary. The next morning, Holmes and I made our way to the offices of Messrs. Pollard and Buxton on Great Marlborough Street. Despite Sebastian Pollard's assurances that he had no further involvement with the Rathbone estate, Holmes had secured permission from Mrs. Lytton to examine all of Maurice Ellison's surviving papers held in the solicitor's vault. We were met by Mr. Hargrave, the firm's senior clerk, who led us through a labyrinth of filing cabinets and steel-bound chests, past the clicking of typewriters and the faint aroma of ink and leather. At the far end stood a solitary iron safe, its door still bearing the fresh scratch marks Holmes had noted in the Rathbone drawing room. Hargrave produced a large key and with a solemn nod admitted us. Inside the safe lay several boxes of documents, neatly labelled yet water-stained. Holmes gently lifted one small, battered leather-bound volume from the pile, its spine cracked and its pages warped by damp. "This," he said, "is Mr. Ellison's diary." He ran a suede glove across the cover, feeling the ridges of gilt lettering now illegible. I set my medical case aside as Holmes opened the book to its first entry. The ink was faded, the paper brittle, yet the clerk's precise copperplate hand remained discernible. We settled at a nearby oak table, Holmes illuminating the page with a small pocket lamp. The earliest entries recorded routine observations, ship manifests, expenditure ledgers, notes on estate correspondence. But as we progressed, the prose grew more clandestine. On the 12th of June, 1915, Ellison had written, "Met Lady Rathbone at dusk in the old wine store. She insists on secrecy. I dread that what I've found may irreparably harm her reputation and ours." Holmes's eyes gleamed as he read the passage. "He wrote openly of secret meetings in the cellar," he murmured. He perceived that Lady Rathbone feared exposure. Yet he continued these rendezvous, compelled by duty or perhaps by compassion. He paused, turning several pages. "Here, cipher 13, repeated twice this month. It must refer to the charred vellum fragment we recovered, and note the underlining. Beneath the notation was a single word in shorthand, confe. The entry continued, 13, confession. Papers speak of alliances, one broken by love unworthy. The confessor listens, cloaked in vestments, yet harbouring darker intent. Holmes frowned at that last phrase. The confessor, he said thoughtfully. Ellison was aware of a third party present at these midnight conferences, one clothed in ecclesiastical garb. The diary implies that this figure was not just a spiritual guide, but an active participant in clandestine affairs. I leaned in, noting the heavy water stains blotching the text. Many of these pages have suffered serious damage, I remarked. We may have lost critical passages. Indeed, Holmes agreed, but the damage itself is informative. It suggests deliberate attempt to obscure certain details, perhaps by the very hand that orchestrated Morris's downfall. He turned to a later entry, dated 3rd July 1915. She trembled at the threshold as I offered the cipher. I saw him watching, silent as a stone. Before the flames consumed our proofs, he moved with solemn grace, extinguished the light, and barred the door. The final entry ended abruptly, the sentence cut off mid-word by a tear smear of ink. Note, Holmes said, pointing, that Morris refers to two persons, she and him. She would be Mrs. Lytton, and him cannot be Lady Rathbone. He watched, silent as a stone, the confessor himself. One can imagine his chill stillness in the cellar, witnessing the destruction. I reflected on Holmes's words. If the confessor was complicit in burning the documents, he must know far more about the plot than any other witness, and his presence alone might explain the religious symbolism, the twin daggers, the confession burnt in a former wine vault, repurposed as a confessional. Holmes carefully replaced the diary face down and closed the leather cover. These entries confirm my suspicions, Watson. Ellison discovered incriminating correspondence, letters between Lady Rathbone and enemy agents, using his clerk's access to manipulate estate funds. The confessor, most likely Father Beaumont, was summoned to witness and to cleanse the sin. Yet when Ellison threatened to publish the cipher, Beaumont's loyalty to his patron drove him to violence. I paused, considering the medical evidence. The wound on Ellison's collarbone was delivered from above and behind, as though by someone standing at the top of the cellar stairs. If Beaumont bound him first, intending only to intimidate, he must have panicked when Morris cried out, driving the blade home in a rash flash of fear. Holmes nodded, retrieving a small magnifier to inspect the tear smear that had obliterated the diary's conclusion. Also of note is the blotting paper residue adhering to several pages, indicating that Ellison had hidden fresh letters within this tome, likely removed by the same hand that saturated the pages with water, a brutal but effective method of erasure. He slid the diary into a protective envelope and handed it to Hargrave. "You will return this to Mrs. Lytton forthwith. I doubt she wishes its revelations to remain hidden." Holmes stood his tall form, casting a long shadow across the vault's lamp-lit floor. "Our next step is clear. We must confront Father Beaumont with these discoveries. I shall write to him at the Rathbone Chapel, requesting an immediate appointment. If he evades us, I shall proceed to his lodgings. Watson, I will require your presence when we interrogate him. His medical testimony regarding Ellison's death may expedite Beaumont's confession." Watson retrieved his satchel. "I will prepare notes on the wound orientation and the likely sequence of events, binding, struggle, fatal blow. These will serve well in questioning." Holmes's lips curved in approval. "Excellent. And I shall also consult the German consulate regarding that leather fragment. The more evidence we amass, the narrower the confessor's options become." He paused at the doorway, turning for one last look at the stacks of legal documents. Morris Ellison wrote in this diary his final entreaty for justice. Let us ensure that his voice, though suppressed for 10 years, now speaks loudly enough to indict the man who watched him die. As we emerged into the damp London afternoon, Holmes tucked his notebook into his coat and inhaled deeply, as if drawing strength from the city's mist. "Time is of the essence, Watson," he said, striding toward the waiting hansom. "The confessor's conscience may yet stir, but if he senses our pursuit, he may flee or destroy further evidence. We must act before the trail grows cold anew." I followed him without hesitation, heart quickened by the prospect of closure for Maurice's family. The diary had proved a watershed, its decayed pages restoring not only a narrative, but a path to justice. And as the cab rattled away, I knew that the 6th chapter of this decade-old murder would lead us inexorably to its penultimate revelation, the unmasking of the silent watcher, clothed in vestments whose betrayal had consigned Morris Ellison to oblivion. Chapter 7. The Silent Witness. A week passed before Holmes and I returned to the Rathbone family chapel on Bruton Place. The air was chill, and a fine mist drifted through the narrow streets. The chapel's stone facade, once grand with Gothic tracery, now stood sombre beneath creeping ivy. Holmes strode past the wrought iron gates with resolute purpose. I followed, cane in hand, prepared to confront the man whose silent vigil had spanned a decade. We entered by a side door, finding ourselves in the vestry, a modest room panelled in dark oak, its shelves lined with dusty hymnals and ritual vestments. Holmes's keen gaze flicked to a small brass plaque on the wall. Reverend Alexander Beaumont, chaplain to the House of Rathbone, 1912 to 1919. The name confirmed our suspicions. He turned to me. "Watson, our quarry hides behind these walls. Let us proceed with caution." The main chapel lay beyond an archway draped in burgundy velvet curtains. Pushing them aside, Holmes and I stepped into the nave. Wooden pews stretched in perfect rows beneath a vaulted ceiling, painted with saints and starry heavens. At the far end, the altar, flanked by tapering candles, looked pristine, as though no sinner had ever knelt before it. Yet a single confessional booth stood to one side, its door ajar. Holmes's lips curved slightly. "The silent witness," he whispered. Approaching the booth, Holmes examined the floor, a faint smear of damp earth, perhaps mud, brought in on a boot, traced a path from the door to the inner recess. He crouched, inspecting the footprint. Size 9, gentleman's cut. Possibly the same boot that bore the leather fragment we recovered. With care, you may see that the sole's pattern matches continental manufacture rather than a London cobbler's work. I peered over his shoulder. "Surely Bishop Armitage would have approved such boots," I murmured, but Holmes shook his head. "Our Beaumont served abroad during the war, I believe, Watson. His boots would have been custom-made, likely by a German firm on requisition orders for coalition officers. A fragment from the cellar, and these imprints belong to the same maker." Stepping inside the confessional, Holmes scanned the walls. "Witness the scorch here," he said, pointing to faint ochre stains on the booth's panel. They correspond exactly to the pattern in the cellar, a brazier set within the booth, papers consumed in ritualistic fashion, then the booth repurposed as a hiding place for secrets. The murderer fancied himself both priest and judge. He poked at the seat with his cane, revealing a small rivet, distinctive, triangular in shape. Holmes produced the twin dagger's hilt from his pocket and aligned the rivet's indentation with the pommel's matching groove. "The dagger rested here for some time," he said. "Our Beaumont must have returned to his chapel, perhaps to meditate on his deed, and left the weapon as a macabre keepsake. But now, the time for contemplation ends." Holmes stood, turning toward the chapel door. "He cannot remain here. Watson, fetch Dr. Sterling's testimonial on Ellison's wound orientation. We need a medical warrant for this man's arrest." I nodded and swiftly departed to retrieve my medical notes from the vestry. On my return, we located the vestry window and peered out to see Beaumont's lodgings across the courtyard, a modest house of red brick and white sash windows. "We shall proceed directly to his residence," Holmes said, replacing the dagger's hilt in his coat pocket. Better to forestall his flight. He hurried through the vestry and out into the damp courtyard, the echo of our footsteps swallowed by the hush of early evening. At the front door of Beaumont's lodgings, Holmes rapped twice, then thrice, and waited. Footsteps approached, followed by the creak of heavy wood. The door opened to reveal a tall, gaunt figure in cassock and collar, his pale features drawn. "Reverend Beaumont, I presume?" Holmes began crisply. "I am Sherlock Holmes of 221B Baker Street, and this is Dr. John Watson. You are under suspicion of complicity in the death of Maurice Ellison, clerk to the Rathbone estate, who disappeared in July 1915 and whose remains were found recently in Lady Rathbone's hovel." Beaumont's lips pursed in evident unease. "I know nothing of which you speak," he replied, voice smooth as candle wax. "Maurice Ellison vanished. Terrible tragedy, and I conducted the last rites as chaplain, but beyond that I have no involvement." His eyes flicked past Holmes toward the street, as though seeking an escape. Holmes stepped forward, producing my medical report. "Dr. Watson's analysis confirms a single lethal wound inflicted at an angle inconsistent with self-defense or accident. The blade struck with downward force from the top of the cellar stairs, in keeping with the blow of someone standing above a victim. That precise angle matches the confessional booth's geometry in this very chapel, an architectural signature known only to its occupants." Beaumont swallowed. "You have no proof," he whispered. Holmes's gaze bored into him, calm yet unyielding. "We have your footprints, senor, the leather fragment and the rivet match those found in the cellar. We have your presence as the confessor recorded in Ellison's diary, describing your cold stillness amidst burning papers. We have your dagger left in the confessional booth as though signed by your hand. And we have the medical confirmation that those papers were not merely burned by chance, but that Ellison's life was snuffed out deliberately by one in a position of trust." Beaumont's shoulders slumped, the tension draining from his stance. His voice trembled. You have read the diary." Holmes inclined his head. "I have, and I have questioned the witnesses." "Why, Beaumont? Why take Maurice's life?" The chaplain's eyes filled with sudden torment. "He discovered what I had done," Beaumont rasped. "The tally of correspondence, money, diverted to treasonous ends. Our Lady feared ruin, scandal worse than death. I was instructed to preserve her good name, to save the estate. At first, I meant only to frighten him, to bind his hands and purge those cursed letters by fire. But when he cried out in pain, something within me snapped. I struck, harder than I intended, and he fell." Holmes listened with impassive attention. Beaumont pressed on, voice cracking. "I barred the cellar door. I thought the war would bury the crime. I took the dagger here to recall my vow, but guilt knows no sanctuary." He fell to his knees, head bowed. "I begged forgiveness from the Almighty, but none came." Holmes produced a set of handcuffs and placed them on Beaumont's wrists. "Your confession spares you the agony of trial, for your truth is laid bare. Yet justice demands its due, even after 10 years. Dr. Watson, shall we escort our confessor to the yard?" Beaumont looked up, tears in his eyes. "Am I damned for this earthly sin?" he whispered. Watson bent to his side with professional compassion. "Repentance need not be despair, Reverend. You confessed truthfully. Your remorse is evidence of conscience. Let the law temper retribution with mercy." Holmes led the way, Beaumont and Watson following, through the chapel courtyard and back into the vestry where the candles still burned low. He paused at the confessional booth's threshold and turned once more. "May this silent witness serve as a reminder. No secret remains buried forever when reason and justice conspire to unearth it." As they emerged into the London twilight, I reflected on our journey. 10 years of obfuscation, of hidden flames and rusted steel, now resolved by the quiet actions of a single, steadfast detective. The game was nearly done. Only one chapter remained, to see that the righteous path of evidence triumphed and that the case of the Decennial Dagger reached its final, satisfying conclusion. Chapter 8. Holmes's Revelation. The drawing room at 221B Baker Street was lit by a solitary lamp and the dancing glow of a fire in the hearth when Holmes summoned Lestrade, Mrs. Lytton, and the newly apprehended Reverend Alexander Beaumont to witness the case's final accounting. Mrs. Lytton, pale yet composed, sat beside Lestrade on a deep leather settee. Beaumont, in worn clerical black, stood trembling near the mantel. Watson and I took seats against the opposite wall, tools of our respective professions, medical notes and papers, resting at our sides. Holmes reclined in his favourite armchair, pipe alight, his steady gaze sweeping the assembled company. "Thank you all for coming," he began in measured tones. "We are here to resolve a mystery that has lain dormant for a decade, the disappearance and death of Maurice Ellison, clerk to the Rathbone estate. It is my intention this evening to show how every clue, no matter how obscure, guided us to the truth, and to explain how the disparate fragments coalesce into a single, unerring solution." He turned to Lestrade. "Inspector, will you kindly summarize the physical discovery?" Lestrade cleared his throat. "On the morning of the 12th of May 1925, a skeleton was uncovered in the sealed cellar of a derelict hovel, once part of the Rathbone estate. The remains bore a single penetrating wound to the right clavicle, delivered from above. Beside them lay a rusted dagger embedded in the brickwork, its twin discarded amid the cellar's earth." Holmes nodded, raising his finger for emphasis. "Precisely. The wound's trajectory, as confirmed by Dr. Watson's post-mortem examination, indicated a downward strike by someone standing at the top of the stairs. We shall address the significance of that location shortly. Before we proceed, Miss Lytton, you may recall that Maurice, your late husband, was engaged to be married in June 1915. He vanished on the night of 3rd July, and for 10 years no inquest was held, partially due to the exigencies of the Great War and the influence of Lady Rathbone. Mrs. Lytton inclined her head. "Yes, I was told he eloped to preserve the family's reputation. I believed it until the truth emerged." Holmes produced Ellison's diary and held it before the group. This volume, recovered from the solicitor's vault, contains the clerk's own words. In entries dated June and July 1915, he references secret meetings in the wine store cellar of the estate, meetings conducted under cover of night with Lady Rathbone, and one he refers to only as the Confessor. The cipher XIII appears repeatedly, denoting confession. Under this cipher, Maurice recorded suspicions of correspondence between Lady Rathbone and foreign agents, evidence of funds siphoned from estate accounts to an unknown end. He laid the diary upon the low table. Now let us consider the cellar itself, a former wine vault converted into a makeshift confessional. The scorch marks we observed indicated deliberate burning of documents. The perpetrator set up a brazier at the center, consumed the incriminating letters, then left in haste, failing only to remove the dagger. Holmes paused, inhaling deeply from his pipe, as though drawing the next thought into sharper relief. The dagger, two matched blades bearing the intertwined Rathbone and Ellison crest, were ceremonial in nature, not martial. One was driven into the victim's body, the other was discarded outside the cellar's far wall. A fragment of German-made leather from an officer's boot was found bound to the hilt of the discarded blade. Lestrade frowned. A German officer's involvement would suggest espionage. "Not necessarily," Holmes replied. "Rather, it points to someone who possessed such boots, one Reverend Alexander Beaumont, who served as chaplain to the Rathbone household, and in the Great War wore German-made field boot replacements supplied to Allied chaplains. It is he who possessed both the motive and the means." He turned to Beaumont. "Reverend, you were present at every meeting in that cellar, performing the rites of confession. Your vestments and boots left their mark, literally, in this chapel's confessional booth, and on the cellar floor. You carried the twin blades with you thereafter as a grim reminder of your work." Watson stepped forward, producing the footprint casts and the leather fragments sealed in evidence bags. "This footprint," he said, "matches exactly the sole pattern of your wartime boots, Reverend. And this fragment, once you wore these boots, you bore the same leather." Holmes nodded. "Our second line of evidence comes from the ledger entries in the Rathbone solicitor's book. Morris recorded 13 in shorthand beside 2 private consultations, one with Lady Rathbone, the other with you. Why was he compelled to meet you in private, Reverend, if not to bind and intimidate him?" Beaumont's shoulders slumped, his voice shook. He discovered letters, proof that Lady Rathbone had sent funds to agents in Germany. She feared scandal worse than death. She commanded me to purge those documents and silence him. Holmes continued, undeterred. "And when Mr. Ellison threatened to expose the cipher and its meaning, you were caught between sacred oaths and secular obedience. You bound him in that cellar, intending only to frighten, to cleanse the sin, but his cry of fear roused something in you, panic. You struck with the dagger and delivered a fatal blow." He paused, gaze fixed on Beaumont. "A strike delivered from above, in keeping with the downward trajectory we noted. One stab, precise yet furious, into the right collarbone. The blade remained lodged, forgotten in the chaos as you sealed the door and fled." Lestrade reached for his notebook. "Reverend, do you wish to speak in mitigation now that the truth stands revealed?" Beaumont lowered his head, tears welling. "I loved my calling, and I feared I had betrayed it. I believed I served a higher duty to protect Lady Rathbone's name, and I failed both my God and my conscience." Holmes folded his hands. "Let us turn, finally, to Mrs. Lytton. Madam, you wear this pearl brooch, once a wedding gift, the gentlest touch upon a grieving widow's heart, yet at the time you received it, your charm masked the trauma within." Mrs. Lytton's lips trembled. "I knew nothing of the cellar, nothing of the documents, until the day the skeleton was brought forth." Holmes handed her Morris's letters, those not wholly consumed by fire. Letters he wrote in hope, in love. They speak of faith in your union and horror at your aunt's plot. These, at least, he intended for you to read. I trust you will preserve them in his memory. Tears glistened in her eyes as she accepted the papers. "I shall." Holmes turned to Lestrade once more. "Reverend Beaumont, you stand accused of murder in the first degree and of concealing evidence of treason. I recommend you be escorted to New Scotland Yard without delay." Beaumont nodded, offering no resistance. Lestrade produced a warrant, and as officers moved in to place him under arrest, Holmes concluded, "This case demonstrates that even the most elaborate conspiracies will crumble under the light of observation and reason Maurice Ellison's voice, though silenced in body, has cried out through his writings and his remains. Justice, though delayed by a decade, has arrived at last. As the officers led Beaumont away, Watson rested a hand upon Holmes's shoulder. "Another triumph for your singular method, Holmes." Holmes allowed himself the faintest of smiles. "Triumph perhaps, Watson, but let us not forget the cost. A life lost, a family shattered. Yet if our efforts prevent such tragedies in future, then Maurice Ellison's sacrifice shall have served a just purpose." Mrs. Lytton rose and approached Holmes, offering her thanks with quiet dignity. "I cannot repay you," she said softly, "but you have given me the truth, and that is more precious than any inheritance." Holmes inclined his head. "The truth is its own reward, madam." And with that, the final embers of the fire glowed softly, as if in approval, and the decennial shadows that had cloaked Holloway's cellar and the Rathbone secrets for 10 long years were banished forever by the clarity of reason and the unwavering light of justice. Thus closed the case of the Decennial Dagger.